What's up, y'all? Coming at you today with a quick unplanned video I scripted up in a few hours when I was supposed to be prepping for family to come visit. I was reading through some of y'all's comments and I found one that got me really fired up, and I wanted to get this out there before life descends into family madness. So if y'all could maybe overlook my lack of freshness, I'd appreciate y'all. The first half of this video summarizes my overall approach to Hollow Knight lore diving, which is why some of my findings might have never been kind of discussed in the community before. And hopefully I can use this as a blanket disclaimer for the entire channel. The second half is a rebuttal of a very thorough comment left on my Monomon video, which accused me of fabricating a ton of details, basically lambasting me for going off canon. A large portion of their criticisms can be summed up as, we don't actually know what happened or what that character thought or when something happened, based on an entirely dry and literal reading of the lore. While you should still be able to follow along if you haven't seen the Monomon video, you'll definitely get more out of this if you have. I've linked to it in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Now, this fabrication class of criticism is probably the one that causes me the most anxiety when I'm working on a video. Not because theirs is an invalid reading of the canon, but because these commentators often come to the conclusion, sensibly, given their viewpoint, that I'm just making things up without any source. I worry that I'll either have to address every single one of these, or risk a random viewer coming in, reading this comment, and just writing me off as somebody who's making up fan canon or making things up willy-nilly, and that could not be farther from the truth. I didn't make this video in an attempt to own this commenter, which would be ridiculous. I just figured that as long as these comments are living inside my mind, they might as well pay rent. Put simply, the foundation of my analysis is treating Hallownest as a real place and the characters that reside there as real people, much in the same way that the Souls lore community treats their games. On the surface, that seems kind of ridiculous, right? The FromSoft games are about people, no matter how fantastical the setting, and Hollow Knight is just about some cute damn bugs. But if you're willing to earnestly engage with the world that Team Cherry has built on its own terms, you'll start to understand how sophisticated, how layered, and how consistent their world design and environmental storytelling really are. I think it's criminal that most people, even people who love this game, will never see that depth, and that's what inspired me to start this channel, if I'm honest. So, we're treating the characters and the setting as real. What does that change? Basically, I've opened up what I consider to be a canon source to include both environmental clues and motivations and the character of any particular lore source. For instance, some people have taken issue with the fact that in my analysis, it is canon that Fog Canyon was once part of Green Path. Let's talk about it. My first video covered the reasoning about the layered storytelling of Hollow Knight by analyzing the environmental design of the Queen's Gardens. Now, I hope you've seen that video, but if you haven't, let me just quickly summarize. Queen's Garden gives us a great example of how we can confirm directly stated lore as being represented by the environmental design of an area. So with Queen's Gardens, we're specifically told that it used to be Green Path, that the Queen then laid claim to it, and that once everything happened and Hallownest fell, the garden fell into disrepair and became more wild, and it was also taken over or colonized by a traitor faction of the Mantis tribe. And so knowing that we can see in an area's environmental design echoes of the lore of that place, looking at Fog Canyon, we can see sort of the flora and fauna, so to speak, of Fog Canyon layered on top of what is very clearly Green Path native flora and fauna. The easiest to point out would be specifically the vines and the spiral rocks. Now, if you remember, not only can we find those spiral shapes in very few places outside of Green Path, but if you think about where we fought Hornet, if you think about the Lake of Un, all these sort of sacred places to the green children of Green Path, Un and her followers, you'll see this spiral motif everywhere, especially if you actually look inside the sort of chapel or, I don't know, the building that's at the edge of the Lake of Un. You'll see sort of a dilapidated statue of Un that is just covered in spirals. So, I mean, to me, Reading that, it becomes very obvious that Team Cherry is trying to show us that this used to be Green Path. So that's a good example of an environmental clue that I can take and that I will consider to be canon because it's pretty clear, and, you know, we can extrapolate that if places with explicit lore have environmental design, realistic environmental design, you know, striations over time that match up with that lore, then if we have another place that has very clear striated history shown through the environmental design, that even if there's not explicit lore telling us this or that, that we can extrapolate that that is what happened. Now, lore-wise, or as an example of deeper consideration of the motivation and character of a lore source, let's talk about the apparently canon, at least according to the wiki, conclusion that the king intentionally shed his worm shell in order to not frighten and to better match the bugs of Hallownest. The source of this idea is God's secret dialogue that reads, "God King, you reduced your form to match our meager shells." However, the Godseeker is characterized as a religious zealot and goes from calling us cringer and loathing our very presence to lavishing us with praise as soon as we prove our strength. So why should we treat the words of a prayer to her God King as being capital T truth? Even if you disagree with me there, the king himself disproves this idea by misrepresenting himself in every depiction, from statues to fountains to his king's idols. And before you accuse me of being overly reliant on what Lem has to say, we can see this fact with our eyes. So if the king had descended from on high from his fearsome worm shape to become a common bug so that the bugs of Hallownest could identify and relate with him, then why did he spend all this time, energy, and pale ore resource depicting himself as some kind of monstrous figure who was so strong and huge when we see homie's tiny? Those two ideas just don't line up. Lastly, Bardoon directly states that the worm came to Kingdom's Edge to die. He does say that for a being like the worm, death is more of a transformation, but he's employing that as a metaphor to nod to the fact that a different entity was spawned, using his words, from the death of the worm. And if we apply that same kind of character analysis to Bardoon, the gentle, humble giant who crawled away from the screaming light of the infection and speaks authoritatively about the birth of the Pale King, he's a far more reliable source than the mental projection of a tribe of beings melded into a gigantic golden religious zealot. So no, I don't think that he shrunk himself down to match the bugs of Hallownest. Using all of the clues we have around us and taking into consideration who is telling us what, it seems completely ridiculous that that was the goal here. Okay, so the opening up of my definition of canon is what leads directly to most of the things which are then deemed fabricated by commenters like the one I'm responding to. On the one hand, yes, because Team Cherry haven't directly confirmed any of the claims that I'm making, you can call them speculation. But on the other hand, they built this world and all the characters in it, and they did so with such deliberate consistency and depth that ignoring all of that in favor of a literal reading of the text seems to me like a mistake. The implication is that you assume Team Cherry are careless designers and that none of these myriad visual and character choices were made with any reason beyond propping up the explicit text. It's also just less fun. Now, to make it explicit how this whole extra canon thing applies to the criticisms that were made in the comment, let's look at a specific example. In my Monomon video, I stated that Monomon met up with the king at the site of the teacher's archives to pitch the idea, as well as asking him to build a pipeline to transport the acid from what we'd later call Yzma's Grove to the archive site. The comment here basically calls that entirely fabricated, especially the meeting with the king, as we are never told this happens directly in the text. Here's a quick rundown of my evidence for the claim. 1. The Wanderer's Journal directly states that the king had to approve every single tram pass ever sold. This characterization as needing to be in charge of everything matches up with lots of canonical details, such as him commissioning these exaggerated likenesses of himself. It's all about the king. 2. The Resting Grounds lore tablet says that she's sleeping in her archives. 3. There are only 4 kinds of living things that can survive contact with the acid. The Durandus, the weird coral plants that we can see growing in the acid otherwise, the green foliage in the grove, and Monomon. Now you may say, there's 5 because the knight can directly survive being in the acid, but that's not true. If you actually look closer, what Yzma's tear is doing is pushing the acid away so that the knight is just surrounded by clean water. The knight isn't actually surviving contact with the acid, we're just never contacting the acid. Number 4, the only place that we ever see the acid serve a purpose is in the archives, where we can see it being used as a storage medium for Hallownest knowledge, and apparently a power source to keep the whole archive working. It's also used to preserve Monomon, apparently perpetually. 5. The entrance, archway, and bench both bear the image of Monomon's mask, and don't feature the king's horns or the seal of Hallownest like nearly every other piece of architecture in the entire game. Number 6. The pipes which we can directly observe dripping acid or transporting acid visually match the ones built in the royal waterways. The grove and the acid flow control switch were guarded by Yzma and Ogrim, 2 of the king's great knights. Lastly, Ogrim doesn't know that Yzma's dead and seems to not know much of the current state of the world, which implies that Ogrim has been stuck there since he was ordered to protect that infrastructure. We do know that Monomon was beloved by the king. We know that she didn't build the building and the pipes herself. Even if he didn't directly commission the construction, he must have approved of it, and that she was the only one who figured out how to use the acid for storage power. So I don't feel like it's a huge leap to state that somewhere, at some point, they must have gotten together to discuss the archives. Of course, I have no idea when or where they met, which is why I mentioned speculation in the video intro. I want to tell an interesting narrative, so I fill in some of these gaps with some storytelling that vibes with everything we know about the world and characters, and I make sure that none of it ever contradicts what we know for certain. However, there's a drastic difference between making up tiny details like they met on a Tuesday at 4 a.m. for the sake of the story and basing everything I say on fabrications and no real research. That is quite the leap, I think. Enough of my general approach. Let's get to some specifics about this comment. At 227, which is where I say Monomon's story begins, basically, this commenter said, "It is uncertain as to where Monomon's story begins relative to the founding of Hallownest. We don't know where she was born, let alone if she's a native to the kingdom." And this is kind of what I'm talking about. I'm saying that the story of Monomon beginning here, I'm not saying that she was born at that moment. I never stated where she was born, where she comes from, or any of those things. I'm saying that our story, the parts that we know about her story, this is where that starts. You know, I assume at that point already that she's already known by the king, she's already the teacher, she's already, you know, all these things. So I don't understand where the logical leap comes from that says that I'm dictating that this is when and where she was born, or that she's from Hallownest. Like, what is the point of this criticism? It feels like you're looking for places to go, aha, you are implying this and that we don't know about. Like, okay. Number 2, 3 seconds later at 2:30, nothing ever mentions this supposed meeting between Monomon and the Pale King. The pipe system mentioned is entirely unrelated, and it isn't relevant to the story. It's guarded by Ogrim and is disabled by the events of the game. Well, I completely disagree that the pipe system is unrelated. That pipe system is the transport mechanism that is used to move the acid from its origin in the grove. Edit and Eric here, interrupting this ADHD moment to bring you the rest of the thought really quickly because this girl is about to go sprinting down a tangent and get lost. What she was trying to say is, the pipeline transports the acid from its origins at Yzma's Grove down the way to the site of the archives, so how can it be irrelevant? Got it? Right, that's me done then. Time to crack on with your shockingly unkempt presenter, who's about to lay out their evidence that Yzma's Grove is the origin of the acid blight. Which we know of because Mr. Mushroom, who seems to know goddamn everything about everything, says that Yzma's Grove is the source of the acid blight. So that's canon, homie. Next, Yzma is in the grove at the beginning of where all the pipes are, which we can clearly see when we drain them. I mean, the fact that hitting the switch, which restarts the motion of moving the acid, drains the grove, would sort of imply that the pipeline starts in the grove and moves the acid elsewhere, which is what I'm directly stating. You know, clearly the teacher's archive is sitting in a lake of acid. So we know where the acid comes from. We know that it's gone to the teacher's archive for use there. So I don't see how the pipeline is irrelevant. All right, next point. Where is it stated that 2 of the 5 great knights guarded her archives? This is fabricated. Now, this is where I start getting kind of pissed off about being called a liar, basically, because you're misrepresenting what I'm saying. I am not saying that they were guarding the archives. I've never stated that. I said that they were guarding the pipeline. And as I just established, we know that Yzma's guarding the grove, and we know that Ogrim has been spending so much time guarding the infrastructure of the pipeline itself, like the control flow system or whatever you want to call it, that he doesn't even know that his true love is dead. Homie hasn't left. So I'm not sure how you can disagree with the fact that these 2 of the 5 great knights have been deployed to go protect these places. Okay, next. Plenty of mortal beings resist and are immune to the infections, such as the hunter. So this is in response to me saying that Monomon was trying to figure out how to protect the archive and herself against this infection. You know, she couldn't utilize the king's guards or the king's knights because those are mortal bugs. And as we can see, mortal bugs, normal ass mortal bugs just don't survive. This response says plenty of them survive and then points to a mysterious, super powerful being called the Hunter that we don't know if they're what we would consider a normal mortal. Like, maybe they can be killed, but they've certainly been around for a while. B, they're so incredibly powerful that they have detailed notes and thoughts on literally every single thing that we meet in the entirety of the game. I'm not certain that you're making the point that you think you're making, but I will try to make the point that I think you're trying to make. Now, I guess I could have spoken more clearly and said that most mortal bugs can't resist. But I'm talking, the archive is all about Hallownest, right? Which means not the Mantis tribe, which means not the bees, which means not anybody who's outside of Hallownest. So yeah, a lot of those things survive, and I will cover why they survive in a video that I've already got scripted that I will be recording very shortly. But I kind of figured it would be understood that since she's talking about preserving all of Hallownest's knowledge, that if I'm talking about mortal bugs, I'm talking about the average citizens of Hallownest. And it's pretty clear that they all dead, dude. On top of that, you've got the traitor mantis, a gigantic mantis who has taken in the infection. You've got the Soul Master, this huge, important, learned bug who's still around, but was fooled by the infection into taking it in, thinking it was the answer to all its problems. So this, to me, is just being pedantic and trying to win an argument that I'm not even trying to have with you. You're trying to find fault in what I'm saying. And could I technically have said most or the vast majority? Sure. You got me. Good job. Moving on to the next one. Neither the seals nor the chains holding the Hollow Knight are created with void. The chains are metal, and we know this based on the sound made when they're struck with the knight's nail. This is in response to me saying that the Black Egg Temple was strengthened with void bindings, which is absolutely true. Again, you're misrepresenting what I said. I said the bindings were strengthened by void bindings. This is absolutely canon, as Hornet tells us. That space is built to sustain your likes. Its bindings would drain me were I to join. We know that soul bindings, which are made by the Weavers, wouldn't hurt her, and we know that the vessels are made of soul and void, so the only thing left that would strengthen a vessel but hurt Hornet is void. Void bindings. 344, we don't know, again, what Monomon went through in making her decision. Now, This is mostly dealt with in the first half of my video. Basically, we know that Monomon decided to sleep eternally, to end her life functionally, to preserve the diversity of mind of the kingdom. That she'd archived all this knowledge, and that she's known as the capital T teacher. So for a second, just try to put yourself in her tentacles, or whatever. Imagine that you are her. You know, your entire purpose of being is to spread knowledge and preserve knowledge amongst all the bugs of Hallownest. So if you know that there's this threatening infection that you are trying to be a part of this plan to deal with, and that it's killing off all these bugs, do you really think that it's a jump to say, oh, well, she was worried about protecting herself, and that if things weren't done correctly, that there'd be no bugs left to read the knowledge, all the knowledge that she had stored? Like, again, this is where somebody is taking the exact canon, and anything that goes outside of exactly what is explicitly stated is verboten. And that's so fucking boring. It's also just not how you analyze characters. When the characters are written with enough fidelity and enough consistency to be treated as real people. This is just basic media analysis. Next, nobody was considerate of if the Hollow Knight was going to fail, because according to the Pale King, the plan was inherently true, which was of course shown to be false. There was no backup plan. This is in response to me saying that, or to me mentioning that Monomon would want to have a plan in place for her protection and for the archive's protection that could survive the worst case scenario of the king's plan failing. It's not like she could have reacted to the failure of the plan and then decided to do it all, because she was asleep. She wasn't able to act. So if Monomon didn't think that there was a chance the plan would fail, then why would she create a life form which is sustained by the infection? I mean, if she thought that the infection was gone forever and there was 0% chance that it would ever come back, why on earth would she do that? If she thought the only possible outcome of the king's plan was that Hallownest continued eternally with no infection, then why would she build Umu, the uncanny god of knowledge, to protect herself as she slept? Who was she protecting herself from if the king was just going to stay in power and everything was going to be great and rainbows and puppies and kittens? Alright, next. Whether or not her life forms were powered by the infection or simply store infection within themselves is unknown. This is in reaction to me talking about how genius it was that she built this life form, the Uma, and the other one whose name I can never remember, the jellies, to contain the infection. Okay, so you're saying that whether they are powered by it or store it within themselves, it's unknown. I mean, okay, great. I don't understand what other than pedantry are you trying to accomplish here? If I'm saying that these life forms were created to handle the infection, and you want to disagree about my wording that that is what powers them, well, first of all, you're arguing up a hill, because we know that she was able to use the acid, which literally kills 99.9% of all living things that touch it, not only to preserve her, but to power and store all that extra data. I mean, this is a similar line of research. And secondly, who cares if they're just storing it or if it's powering them? It is the only thing that we can see moving within them. So I just don't understand the objection here. I gotta be honest with you. So my response was, I was first just gonna say it doesn't matter. Both of those ideas accomplish the same thing and you're just arguing over semantics. But then I noticed that you're making a pretty big assumption of stating that Monomon and the Uoma, and Umu, the jellies, are Monomon species. If you're going to try to read everything at strictly a surface level, then allow me to use your logic to debunk your assumption. While the jellies are all the same bluish hue and highly translucent, Monomon is green and completely opaque. She also wears a mask, and none of them do. I see no stated basis for your assumption. So you're doing the same thing that you're accusing me of, except, I don't know, in order to win pedantry points? Next, the time span between the elegy's creation and the vessel's planned transcription and Umu's birth and her slumber is unknown. So basically we get to, this is like the ultimate version of this general argument. Okay, cool. Let's deal with this one. Yep, it's unknown, but we do know that the king, like the rest of his kingdom, was panicking trying to deal with the infection and would have been trying to do things as quickly as possible. That means that Monomon would likewise have been rushing to accomplish things before she slept. Do you see what I mean about how a literal reading of the text blinds you to tons of information that Team Cherry has built into the world? Even if you disagree with this and think that the king would be super chill with all of his subjects dying en masse to an infection caused by an enemy he thought he long ago got rid of, does it change the point of what I'm saying? I don't think so. Next is when I stated that the second wave of infection just tore through Hallownest as opposed to going slower like the first wave did. This person says, the return of the infection didn't immediately enslave everyone. The hunter states that it took years for the infection to pool in the ancient basin. Okay, so the return of the infection did take everyone very, very quickly. The Slobbering Husk journal entry from the hunter says the infection that swept through Hallownest so long ago, not crept through Hallownest, not slowly took one bug at a time, swept through Hallownest. And of course, it took a long time for actual liquid, the infection, to pool in the ancient basin, which is at the very bottom of the kingdom. Well, the bottom of the kingdom if you haven't unsealed the abyss. I mean, that's irrelevant to the point. I'm clearly referring to the bugs which were citizens of Hallownest. None of the bugs that we see in the ancient basin match that description. We don't see a bunch of dead husks of normal citizens in the ancient basin. So I don't understand why you would say that because it took forever for a liquid to travel down to the basin, that means that it took forever for the bugs, which were in different places, to be affected. And also, if the second wave had happened slowly, then why have the corpses of the infected bugs just been left wherever they fell? I mean, surely the other citizens would have moved their fathers and mothers and husbands and wives and sons and daughters, whether just out of respect or by law of the king, who was very self-conscious about the way that Hallownest was seen by outsiders. It had to be very prestigious and clean and all of those things. Like, that would have besmirched his pure honor. Next, in response to me talking about how the second wave of the infection led to this explosion of the jelly population, and we have a response saying, we don't even know if her species is capable of reproduction, so this is completely baseless. Again, you're just assuming, you're making this big assumption that I'm saying, or that the truth of the matter is that the jellies are the same species as Monomon. And I've already discussed how ridiculous that is, so I'm just gonna move on. The big one. So I start talking about the God Particles, right? Response goes, this is entirely false. The ambient essence particles do not necessarily correlate to a given influence, let alone a higher being. AKA, correlation isn't causation. Anyways, not all unique essence colors are via higher beings. You ignored a prior comment of mine in this regard. Grey Prince Zote has a unique essence color, despite literally being a fragment of Bretta's mind. This is on top of how Godhome has a unique essence color, despite none of the God Seekers themselves being higher beings. Okay, the God Particles. Now, I have recorded the voiceover for a nearly 20-minute video showing my evidence for the God Particles. I will scroll the script on screen here, and you can pause if you would like to spoil yourself, just so you know I'm not making this up. I'm going to work that video into my near-term schedule, thanks for reminding me, so I won't go into the full screed here. However, I will rebut your exact example. Of course, Grey Zote has his own colored particles. We're in Beretta's mind. Just like the bubble particles reflecting the power that comes from the jelly's worshipful devotion to Monomon, the pink particles here reflect Beretta's devotion and worship, not so much of Zote, but of love itself. And we can see that because first she falls madly in love with some mischaracterization of the knight, and then as soon as Zote shows up, oh no, that's the one that she's in love with. This is why every time that we beat Zote, we see Beretta externally growing more uncomfortable with Zote, yet internally doubling down on his greatness, putting him on an even higher pedestal, lying to herself. until even the greatest version of him that she could ever imagine is beaten by the night and she can no longer deny the truth. And she leaves to find a life or to find a meaning for herself that isn't wrapped up in worship of another person. This is amazing characterization that feels nearly accusatory and at least very, very familiar to many people, myself included, specifically when it comes to the ridiculous flowery writing. I don't want to talk about it. And you miss all of this characterization and all of that just to stick to explicit canon. It seems a real shame, you know? It's the same reason, and for your point about Godhome, we're in the mind of the Godseeker. Of course the particles match the gold aesthetic of their external form. I mean, do you not have a problem with the fact that out of nowhere, the entire world in their mind is just all gold? The sky is gold, everything is gold. So why wouldn't there be shimmery golden essence? Like, that doesn't make any sense. On to our last one, where I talk about how the implication of the kind of vitality and motion and strength of the particles, the bubble particles, the God particles in Fog Canyon relate to us, that this devotion, this worship of Monomon is stronger than any other being. There's no other being around at the time of the game that has this kind of power. And, you know, largely the problem that this person has with this is that the strength, in quotes, of Monomon is completely unknown relative to other beings, let alone someone such as the White Lady. So I feel like this person is intentionally narrowing the definition of strength to mean like, my higher being could beat up your higher being. And that's not what I meant. Obviously, I feel like that's fairly obvious if you watch it. When I say that the God particles reflect the strength of a higher being, I'm talking about the strength of the hold that they have on their tribe, the strength of their people's devotion. So when you compare the dynamic, fast motion of the bubble particles to the languid white particles in the garden, it's no contest. Of course, we're told by the Godseeker and the White Lady herself that she's intentionally hobbling her power by wearing bindings, so I'm not sure why this would be controversial at all. She is the one reducing her own strength. Moreover, it totally makes sense that Monomon would, at the time of the game, be the strongest god in terms of devotion, except for maybe you could argue the Vespa, the queen, but like the thing is, the infection has used the non-individualistic hive mind devotion of the bees to their queen as leverage to infect them by tricking them into thinking that she's still alive. She's dead. So it doesn't matter really how devoted they are to her, she's gone. And you know, the king isn't around. You know, we see in the White Palace that he's got really strong, like stronger white soul particles than the queen. But mostly we see white dream particles. We're in the dream realm, you know, so it makes sense that like they would be sort of soul colored dream particles. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. And there's no other god, no other higher being actively working at the time of the game, right? There's just the dreamers are still around, Hornet's still around, the White Lady is around but hobbled, as she says herself. The king is dead. Who are you comparing Monomon to? Who are you saying that she's not more powerful than, or that the devotion of her people isn't more powerful? Watching this back, I can't believe I didn't immediately come to the same answer that half of you are probably screaming at the screen right now. The Radiance. That's who's stronger. Now, it kind of feels like cheating because it's virally enforced worship. But that aside, it's clear that through her infection, the Radiance has amassed a far greater tribe of devotees than any higher being ever. Apart from the Radiance, though, my point stands. She's a teacher. I'm not saying she's gonna throw down. It's not like, oh, White Lady, catch these hands. I don't understand where this criticism is coming from. It just seems like an intentional misunderstanding or misrepresentation of what I'm saying. And that's it. So overall, this comment can be kind of boiled down to anything not directly stated in lore is fabricated, which naturally leads these people to the conclusion that I'm just out here making shit up all willy-nilly, and that is untrue, and I'm not going to just let that sort of thing stand. Hey y'all, Editing Eric is back one more time. I just want to make it clear, my point in doing all of this is not to win, but to make it obvious that I'm not just making things up. The only reason I may have gotten a little fired up while discussing this is the condescending and smug tone of the comment itself. If the comment had acknowledged the barest possibility of me being correct instead of lecturing me like a willful child, or phrased any of its questions as a conversation instead of a condemnation, I probably would have been happy just answering directly in the comments like I normally do. Instead, you chose to state your reading of the canon, which we've seen is not only internally inconsistent, but also flat out wrong in spots, as incontrovertible fact. Again, normally that's not a big deal. All of us have blind spots, which is why it's fun to discuss this stuff in the first place. But you don't want to discuss, you want to dictate. If the only canon lore that you're interested in hearing about is afforded by a literal reading of the explicit text in the game, then with no ill will, I don't think that this is going to be the right channel for you. However, I hope I've managed to convince even you that nothing that I put in my videos is completely fabricated, apart from small, like, gap-filling details that I, allude to in my intro and saying that there's a little bit of speculation here. But it's a little bit. And it's for stuff that's relatively meaningless, except for, like, crafting a smooth story. Well, now that I've officially responded to one of these anxiety-inducing critiques, I feel a bit of a weight off my shoulders. And I gotta thank this person for reminding me about the God Particles and Higher Being scripts that I've got written, so look forward to seeing those shortly. As always, if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing, and if you think I'm full of shit, I hope you consider leaving a comment telling me exactly why. This person did. And that's gonna do it for this one. I'm recording footage for the Blasphemous and Pale Court videos today as well, and we'll be working to get those out to y'all shortly as I can between, family visiting and all that kind of stuff. Until then, stay safe, be good to each other, and be a little nicer to yourself. You deserve it.